Hi, I'm Rachel Watson and this is my lovely new bakery school. And today I'm going to be showing you how to make a long fermentation granary loaf, which is basically the cheats version of sourdough. Okay, so stage one, plastic bowl, nice and cheap. Throw it on the floor, doesn't matter. Electronic scales, always good because they're so accurate. And in the bowl I have 500 grams of strong plain bread flour, and to that I'm going to add 200 grams of granary or malted barley flour, and then 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And salt is really so important in bread because without salt there's just no flavour to the bread. But you need to be careful that your salt and your yeast don't mix together when the ingredients are wet, so they don't come into direct contact with each other, because the salt can slow the activity of the yeast and in fact can even kill it off. So with this recipe, just 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, tiny amount of yeast. You'd normally use around 200 grams of you'd normally use around 2 teaspoons of yeast for 500 grams of flour, but this dough is going to be rising for a really long period overnight, so you just need a tiny amount just to get it going. I'm going to use my tablespoon to mix this all together, make a well in the middle and add 400 grams of cool water. The temperature of the water determines how quickly or slowly your dough will get moving. It determines how quickly the yeast will wake up and get active. And so this dough is going to be resting, fermenting overnight for the next 14 to 16 hours. So we use really cool water, particularly on a day like today where it's actually 28 degrees C in the bakery. So just using a metal spoon, just mixing all of those ingredients together really quickly, cutting through the dough with the edge of the spoon because that makes it easier to get through all the ingredients. Trying to make sure that you get all the dry ingredients from the bottom of the bowl incorporated into the dough. And there you have it. That is stage one. I'm just going to use my plastic scraper to scrape off the dough from the spoon, and then just to scrape down the edges of the bowl, because as this dough ferments, we don't want dry, scraggy bits falling into the dough. So by the end of stage one, you should have what looks like a fairly shaggy and unprepossessing mess. So I'll just cover the bowl with a shower cap so the dough doesn't dry out, and we'll leave it for half an hour to autolyse. Job done. Okay, so stretch and fold number one. Your dough's been autolysing for the last half an hour or so at room temperature on your kitchen surface. You need a wet hand and a drop of olive oil to stop the dough sticking to your hand quite so badly. Bizarrely, I seem to have really hairy fingers at the back of my hand and the dough always sticks, so I always make sure that I have some olive oil on the back of my hand. So with stretching and folding, I'm right-handed. So I use my right hand to scoop the dough around the bowl, my thumb to support it, and I stretch it as far as I can without it breaking and fold it over. And we'll be doing this about 12 or 13 times. And if you're wondering, why on earth do you do this? It's because you want to develop the gluten in the flour. So the gluten is like an elastic band, and as you stretch and fold, you're making the elastic bands longer and longer and lining them up into a 3D matrix. There are different ways of developing the gluten. Traditionally, you would knead the dough for 10 minutes, and then you would know that at the end of 10 minutes, the mechanical mixing that you have done is enough to allow the gluten to have developed enough to make a loaf, to shape the loaf over about an hour. The other extreme is that you don't do any kneading at all, and you just leave the dough to ferment slowly, slowly overnight. And simply the movement of the bubbles of the dough inside the flour will develop the gluten. So stretch and fold is like a halfway house, really. You're doing some of the mechanical movement, mechanical work yourself, but then the rest is done by time overnight. So I'll just do a few more. You'll notice that it becomes more and more difficult to stretch the dough without it tearing. Just a couple more. Once it starts to really resist the movement, and then we'll cover it up and leave it for an hour or so, and that's normally the time when I'm cooking my dinner. Shower cap on. See you in an hour. So here we are, stretch and fold 2, an hour or so after we've done the first set of stretch and folds. I'll just take off the shower cap, and you can see that the surface of the dough is slightly more shiny than it was. So just as before, I'll get my hand wet on the back of my hand as well, because it always seems to stick to the back of my hand. Some olive oil. And then using the fingers of my right hand, because I'm right-handed, I'll just scoop around the bottom of the bowl. And can you see how incredibly stretchy the dough is now? That's all that gluten, all the elastic developing in the dough. So that's 1 fold, 2 fold, way above the side of the bowl. 3 folds. The dough today is so warm and soft. 4 folds. Now this bit of dough hasn't been stretched, so this should still be quite stretchy. But can you see that the dough is starting to move out of the bowl? So now with this last fold, the whole ball of dough is likely to start moving as I try and stretch and fold it. Can you see that it's hardly moving? And if you keep going, what you'll do is start to tear the surface. So I'll just show you one more. It feels so nice, it's so tempting to keep going, but can you see how I can hardly move it? That's it, you're done. Don't be tempted to keep going. Pick the dough off your fingers, pop your shower cap back on, and leave it for another hour. So here we are, another hour or so after the second stretch and fold. So this is the bit that I would normally do just before I go to bed. And you can see that the dough is now much plumper. It has much more yeast activity. It's really beginning to get going. So I'll do the thing with my wet hand again and a drop of olive oil. Although by now, because the gluten has developed so well, the dough should be much less sticky than when we first started. So again, using my right hand to scoop around the bowl and give a good stretch and a bit of a wiggle and fold over. So can you see that now the dough is so much softer, so much less sticky? Can you see how it's leaving the sides of the bowl clear? That's 2 folds. The 3rd fold, I'm being so much more gentle. Time is of the essence here. You want to go really slowly and gently and just feel what the dough is doing. Third fold, bit of a wiggle, fold over, trying not to tear the surface of the dough. Fifth fold. All of the dough now has been stretched and folded. So if I try and do a last fold, I imagine that the whole of the ball of dough is just going to lift out of the bowl. Just like that. So now we put the shower cap back on again and leave this to ferment overnight in the cold. So in my house, the area by the back door is really cold because it's a stone floor and the door is really leaky. So you get pretty cold draft through. You just need to find the coolest place in your house, which is not a fridge, but is just going to keep the dough slowly fermenting over the next 12 or 14 hours to let that gluten develop. And then we'll have another look in the morning. Here's the dough that's been rising overnight. Actually, last night I had to put it in the shed because it was too warm even by the back door. So the dough now is shiny and wet. You can see the bubbles, and you can see that there are bubbles just sort of dotted around, and that is the secret of the stretch and fold method. That parts of the dough are really stretched and really well developed, so you have really elastic strands, and then other bits of the dough are less elastic, and that's what gives you that fantastic random distribution of bubbles through your cheat sourdough loaf. So just a very slightly damp hand. I'm just going to give this a little bit of a gentle stretch and fold in the bowl. So scooping the dough round, it's really cool. Stretching up, just very gently. The dough just feels so soft and bubbly now. The reason I'm stretching and folding now just in the bowl before I turn it out onto the work surface is that it will make it very slightly easier to shape. So can you see how nicely it's coming away from the sides of the bowl? A little dusting of flour on your work surface. And then using my dough scraper, just releasing the dough from the sides of the bowl. The more you can get off, the less washing up you'll have to do. Until it sits on the work surface as a lovely, pert, plump ball of dough. And with slightly floury fingers, I'm just going to gently stretch this out into a sort of a rectangle shape. And we're going to do now what's called the pre-shape. So taking the sides of the dough and you pull up and over. So you're trying to stretch the surface of this dough but without tearing it. Tack it down, floury fingers. Make sure that the dough is not sticking underneath. Pick up the other side, stretch and over. And can you see how the dough is standing up really firmly? That's a sign that the gluten is working really well. Pull out the end, stretch up, fold over, turn the dough round, stretch up the dough and all the way over to the other side. Can you see it's stretched all the way over? Tack it down. And then we're just going to leave it for 20 minutes underneath the bowl until we do the final shaping, put it in the Banneton, and then leave it again to rest before we bake it. So the dough's been just resting on the work surface, covered by the plastic bowl so the surface doesn't dry out. And we're now going to shape the dough to put in the cane Banneton. And the purpose of shaping is to try and get as much tension into the outside of the dough as possible. So if you can imagine just a balloon and it's only got a small amount of air in it and you want it to just pop with one pin, then if you were to squeeze all the air up to the end of the balloon and then pop it, you can imagine that it would pop very easily. And when we have some dough that we want to turn into a loaf that looks as though it's burst open in the oven, it's the same principle. You're trying to trap all of this air into the smallest volume that you can without bursting the bubbles. I'm going to put a sprinkle of flour around the outside of the dough and use my dough scraper just to flip the dough over onto a floury area. Floury fingers, flattening the dough out again into a rectangle, and you can see that the gluten is really well developed because as I squeeze it out, the dough shrinks back in. It's really elastic. So taking the two corners up and over, the other two corners, I'll just release that dough from the work surface. Really stretching up and over. Oh, there's the alarm. Pop in the really big bubbles of air. Pulling the end up and over 2/3. Tacking it down. And then this last movement, all the way up and all the way over. As far as you can stretch it. Actually, you can see there that I've just torn the dough slightly, so I'm going to put a bit of flour over the top there. And then we're going to transfer it into a cane basket, which will help the dough to rise upwards as it rests over the next half an hour. It also absorbs a small amount of water from the surface of the dough that makes it easier to slash it and gives a really beautiful pattern on the baked loaf. So this is a mixture of half rice flour and half plain flour. You can just use plain flour, but the rice flour seems to absorb a little more of the moisture from the surface of the dough. So if you make sure that the bottom is completely covered, and then a layer of flour, just filling all those grooves just down in the bottom of the basket. I tell you, there is nothing so frustrating as when your dough just is stuck to the basket. So releasing the dough from the surface, it should be a lovely, plump, pert, firm piece of dough. Scooping it up, seam side up, into your basket. And we're going to let this rest just on the work surface now for about 20 minutes before we put it in the casserole in the oven that we've preheated to 250 degrees C. 250 degrees C so that it gets a really intense burst of heat when it goes in the oven. The casserole has been heating in the oven to 250 degrees C for about the last 10 or 15 minutes. Super duper hot. Take off the lid, you can see some fumes coming off from the old flour. Tiny bit of flour just in the bottom, because then if you tip out your dough and it's not quite central, you can give the saucepan a bit of a shake and move the dough around in the saucepan. And the next bit, really, really careful. So just have a look around the edge of the dough to make sure that it's not stuck. And if it is a bit stuck, release it from the cane Banneton and sprinkle a bit of flour down the side. And then tilt the Banneton into the saucepan and tip out the dough. And I don't know if you can see, but it was actually very slightly stuck just here. Then you take your razor blade or lame And you want to slash the dough just in a couple of slashes, one if possible, from one end to the other without burning your hands on the casserole. So just slashing from one end to the other. And because it's so warm today, the dough is actually quite slack and quite difficult to slash. The most important thing, I'm making a right pig's ear of this actually, but the most important thing is to make sure that it's slashed all the way along, because if it's not slashed, where the dough is still intact, it will restrict the movement of the dough and stop it opening up. So it's pretty well slashed now from one end to the other. Not perfectly done, I have to admit. Lid back on and back into your preheated oven at 250, but you're going to turn the oven down now to 220 degrees C and bake the bread for 20 minutes with the lid on the casserole. So just opening the oven door, standing back, because a great big burst of really intense heat will come out. Put your casserole dish in and turn the temperature down to 220. Dinger's gone off after 20 minutes. Time to take the lid off. So you should see that the dough has risen and burst. There we go, inside the casserole, but the dough is still really pale. We can pop it back in again for another 20-25 minutes to give it that lovely burnished crust. Okay, so we'll just check and see if the bread is baked. Oh, open the door, huge burst of heat comes out. And there we go. One fully baked Sheets sourdough loaf. I'll just tip it out of the saucepan. Leave it to cool for an hour. So here we are, finished loaf, lovely open burst, and the pattern from the Banneton. Cheat sourdough, super duper easy, really so easy to fit in the schedule at home, well, particularly for my schedule, and gives you a fantastic loaf of bread in time for lunch the next day.